The late afternoon sun streamed through the dusty windows of Riverview Middle School's history classroom, casting long shadows across the room. Ethan Carter sat hunched over his desk, carefully outlining his history project on the civil rights movement. History was one of his favorite subjects, a chance to learn about people who stood up for what was right against overwhelming odds. But today, his enthusiasm was dampened by the intimidating figure pacing at the front of the room. Mr. Wilkins, the history teacher, was an imposing man in his late 50s with a perpetually furrowed brow and a voice that cut through the air like a whip. Known for his strict demeanor, he had a reputation for singling out students who didn't meet his exacting standards. For Ethan, the scrutiny had always felt harsher, sharper, and far more personal. "Carter!" Mr. Wilkins barked, snapping Ethan out of his focus. The boy flinched, looking up nervously. "Do you think your little essay there is worth my time?" "Yes, sir," Ethan replied softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was that?" Mr. Wilkins demanded, striding toward Ethan's desk. "Yes, sir," Ethan repeated, louder this time, but the tremble in his voice betrayed his fear. The teacher snatched Ethan's notebook from the desk, flipping through the pages with a sneer. "This is what you call effort? My 3-year-old nephew could write better than this garbage. Did you even try?" The classroom fell silent, the other students watching with wide eyes. Ethan's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but he kept his gaze on the floor. He wanted to explain that he'd spent hours on the project, researching and revising, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. "Answer me, boy!" Mr. Wilkins shouted, slamming the notebook onto Ethan's desk. I tried my best, sir," Ethan stammered. "Your best? This isn't even mediocre." Mr. Wilkins leaned closer, his face inches from Ethan's. "Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming and more time working, you wouldn't embarrass yourself like this." The words cut deep, but it was the smirk that followed that stung the most. Ethan felt his hands clench into fists under the desk, but he didn't dare respond. "You're a disgrace," Mr. Wilkins muttered, loud enough for the whole class to hear. As if that wasn't enough, the teacher suddenly grabbed Ethan by the arm, yanking him out of his seat. "Stand up straight when I'm talking to you," he barked, his grip tight enough to leave marks. Pain shot through Ethan's arm, but he bit his lip to keep from crying out. The humiliation was unbearable, but the physical pain was worse. A few students gasped, and one or two muttered in disbelief, but no one dared intervene. The bell rang, signaling the end of the period, but Mr. Wilkins didn't let go. "Get out of my sight," he hissed, finally releasing Ethan with a shove. Ethan grabbed his belongings and bolted from the room, his vision blurred by tears. He didn't stop until he reached the bathroom, locking himself in a stall. He sat on the closed lid of the toilet, cradling his bruised arm and trying to steady his breathing. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt truly powerless. He had dealt with bullies before, but nothing like this. Teachers were supposed to protect students, not make them feel small and worthless. When he finally emerged from the stall, Ethan caught his reflection in the mirror. His arm throbbed where Mr. Wilkins had grabbed him, a faint red mark already forming. But the pain in his chest, an ache of humiliation and anger, was harder to ignore. Ethan wiped his face, took a deep breath, and made his way to the school's parking lot, where his father would be waiting. As he approached the familiar black SUV, he spotted Daniel Carter leaning against the hood, his broad shoulders and rugged features instantly reassuring. But as soon as Daniel saw Ethan's face, his expression shifted from calm to concerned. He crouched down to meet his son's eye level, placing a firm but gentle hand on his shoulder. "What happened, Ethan?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but tinged with worry. Ethan hesitated, the lump in his throat making it hard to speak. But the look in his father's eyes, a mixture of love and determination, gave him the courage to tell the truth. "Mr. Wilkins," Ethan began, his voice breaking. He grabbed me. He said I was a disgrace." Daniel's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. But he took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm for his son's sake. "Get in the car," he said quietly. "We're going to handle this." As they drove home, Ethan glanced at his father, whose knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. He had never seen Daniel this angry before, but it wasn't the kind of anger that scared him. It was the kind that made him feel safe, like nothing in the world could hurt him as long as his father was there. Ethan didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: his father wasn't going to let this go. The drive home was tense, the air in the car thick with unspoken emotions. Ethan sat silently in the passenger seat, staring at his hands. Daniel Carter, his father, kept his eyes fixed on the road, his jaw clenched tightly. Though he didn't say much, his silence spoke volumes. As they pulled into their driveway, Daniel turned off the engine and sat quietly for a moment. Ethan glanced at him, unsure of what to expect. His father was usually calm and collected, the kind of man who could diffuse tension with a joke or a reassuring word. But now, his demeanor was different, colder, more determined. "Come inside," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. Ethan followed him into the house. They dropped their bags near the door, and Daniel gestured for Ethan to sit on the couch. Taking a seat across from him, Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Show me your arm," he said. Ethan hesitated but rolled up his sleeve, revealing the faint red marks where Mr. Wilkins had grabbed him. Daniel's eyes darkened as he studied the bruises, his hands twitching as if he wanted to hit something. "Tell me everything," Daniel said, his tone leaving no room for evasion. Ethan recounted the day's events, his voice trembling as he described the humiliation, the insults, and the physical confrontation. Daniel listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying nothing until Ethan finished. When his son finally stopped talking, Daniel sat back, taking a deep breath. "I'm sorry this happened to you," he said, his voice softening. "What Mr. Wilkins did is unacceptable. No one has the right to treat you, or anyone, like that." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know what to do. He's a teacher." Everyone just watched, but no one did anything. Daniel's heart ached for his son. He had spent years training to fight in a cage, facing some of the toughest opponents in the world. But nothing prepared him for the helplessness he felt seeing his son in pain. "Ethan, listen to me," Daniel said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "This isn't your fault. People like Mr. Wilkins abuse their power because they think they can get away with it. But he won't get away with this. I promise you that." Ethan nodded, comforted by his father's words, though a flicker of doubt lingered in his mind. That evening, after Ethan went to bed, Daniel sat in his home office, scrolling through his contacts. He called a lawyer he had worked with in the past, explaining the situation in detail. The lawyer agreed that what Mr. Wilkins had done was grounds for a formal complaint and potentially a lawsuit. But legal action would take time, and Daniel wasn't sure he could wait. Every time he thought about Mr. Wilkins grabbing Ethan, he felt his blood boil. The image of his son's tear-streaked face replayed in his mind, fueling his anger. By the time the lawyer outlined the next steps, Daniel had already made up his mind. He would handle the legal process, but he wasn't going to sit back and let this slide. The next morning, Daniel woke Ethan up earlier than usual. "We're going to the school," he said. Ethan looked nervous but didn't argue. They arrived at Riverview Middle School just as the doors opened, making their way to the principal's office. Mrs. Anderson, the school principal, was a middle-aged woman with neatly styled hair and an air of authority. She greeted Daniel and Ethan with a polite but detached smile. "Mr. Carter, Ethan," she said, motioning for them to sit. "What brings you here so early?" Daniel wasted no time. "We're here to talk about Mr. Wilkins," he said bluntly. Mrs. Anderson's expression shifted slightly, her smile fading. "What about Mr. Wilkins?" Daniel explained everything Ethan had told him, showing the faint bruises on his son's arm as evidence. Mrs. Anderson listened, nodding occasionally, but her reaction was far from what Daniel expected. "Mr. Carter," she began, folding her hands on the desk. "I understand your concerns, but Mr. Wilkins is a respected teacher with decades of experience. He has a strict teaching style, but I've never received a complaint like this before." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Strict teaching style? My son was humiliated, insulted, and physically assaulted. That's not strict, it's abuse." Mrs. Anderson sighed. "I'll speak to Mr. Wilkins about the incident, but I can't make any promises. These situations are often more complicated than they seem." "Complicated?" Daniel's voice rose, anger seeping into his tone. "There's nothing complicated about a grown man laying his hands on a child." "Please, Mr. Carter," Mrs. Anderson said, holding up a hand. "Let me handle this internally. We have procedures for addressing complaints." Daniel stared at her, his jaw tightening. He didn't trust the school to handle this. Not when they were more concerned about protecting their staff than their students. "Fine," he said, standing abruptly. "But if you won't take action, I will." Mrs. Anderson's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly composed herself. "Mr. Carter, I urge you to remain calm and allow the school to investigate. Escalating the situation won't help anyone." Daniel ignored her, turning to Ethan. "Let's go." As they left the office, Ethan looked up at his father, worry etched across his face. "What are we going to do now?" he asked. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "We're going to make sure this never happens again," he said firmly. That evening, Daniel began making calls to other parents, determined to find out if Ethan was the only victim. What he discovered only strengthened his resolve. Several parents shared similar stories of Mr. Wilkins targeting their children, particularly those from minority backgrounds. By the time he hung up the phone, Daniel had a plan. He wasn't just fighting for Ethan anymore, he was fighting for every child who had suffered under Mr. Wilkins' abuse. Daniel Carter stepped into Riverview Middle School the next morning with a purpose. His broad shoulders and confident stride caught the attention of students and staff alike as he made his way to Mr. Wilkins' classroom. Ethan trailed behind, nervous but determined to support his father. As they approached the door, the sound of Mr. Wilkins' booming voice carried into the hallway. He was berating another student, his words sharp and laced with sarcasm. Daniel's jaw tightened. Without knocking, Daniel pushed the door open. The class fell silent, all eyes on the imposing figure in the doorway. Mr. Wilkins looked up, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion. "Mr. Carter," he said, straightening up. "Can I help you?" "You certainly can," Daniel replied, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk. Now." "I'm in the middle of a lesson," Mr. Wilkins said, glancing at the students. "This won't take long," Daniel said, stepping further into the room. "Everyone out." The students hesitated, looking to Mr. Wilkins for guidance. The teacher frowned but eventually nodded. "Go to the library," he said curtly. Once the room was empty, Daniel closed the door and turned to face Mr. Wilkins. "Let's get one thing straight," he began. "If you ever lay a hand on my son again, you'll regret it." Mr. Wilkins scoffed. "I don't know what you're talking about. Your son is an exaggerator. Kids these days can't handle discipline." "Discipline?" Daniel's voice rose. "You humiliated him, insulted him, and left bruises on his arm. That's not discipline, it's abuse." Mr. Wilkins crossed his arms, clearly unfazed. "You're overreacting. Maybe if you taught your son some respect, he wouldn't be such a disruption." Daniel took a step closer, his towering presence forcing Mr. Wilkins to lean back slightly. "Respect is earned, not demanded. And it certainly isn't taught through fear. For a moment, they stared each other down, the tension in the room palpable. Finally, Mr. Wilkins broke the silence. "You're not scaring me, Carter," he said with a smirk. Daniel smiled coldly. "Good. Because I'm not trying to scare you. I'm here to make sure you understand there are consequences for your actions." Before Mr. Wilkins could respond, Daniel leaned in closer. "I'm filing a formal complaint with the school board. I've already spoken to other parents, and it turns out you have a history of targeting certain students. This ends now." Mr. Wilkins' smirk faltered. "You think you can intimidate me? Go ahead, file your complaint. Nothing will come of it." Daniel's expression didn't change. "We'll see about that." He turned to leave, motioning for Ethan to follow. As they walked down the hallway, Daniel felt a mix of anger and satisfaction. The battle wasn't over, but he had made his stance clear. Daniel wasted no time organizing a meeting with other parents. That evening, he hosted a gathering at a local community center, inviting anyone with concerns about Mr. Wilkins' behavior. To his surprise, the room was packed. Dozens of parents showed up, many of them eager to share their own stories. A mother tearfully recounted how her daughter had been reduced to tears by Mr. Wilkins' cruel remarks. A father described how his son had developed anxiety after being repeatedly singled out in class. The more stories Daniel heard, the angrier he became. But he channeled that anger into action, outlining a plan to hold the school accountable. "We need to present a united front," he said, his voice steady. "If enough of us come forward, they can't ignore us." The parents agreed, signing a petition and drafting letters to the school board. Some even offered to speak at the next board meeting, determined to see change. The school board meeting was held a week later in a crowded auditorium. Daniel and several other parents took turns addressing the board, each recounting their experiences with Mr. Wilkins. Ethan watched from the audience, his heart swelling with pride as his father spoke passionately about the need for accountability. When it was Mr. Wilkins' turn to defend himself, he dismissed the complaints as baseless accusations, accusing the parents of overreacting. But the board members seemed unconvinced, their expressions serious as they took notes. Just as the parents began to feel hopeful, an anonymous letter surfaced, claiming that Mr. Wilkins had a history of misconduct at his previous schools. The letter included detailed accounts of similar incidents, further bolstering their case. Daniel was determined to uncover the truth, reaching out to former students and teachers who could corroborate the claims. The investigation into Mr. Wilkins' behavior began swiftly, spearheaded by a special committee assembled by the school board. The committee comprised parents, educators, and legal professionals, ensuring a thorough and unbiased process. Daniel Carter remained actively involved, providing testimony and evidence he had gathered from other parents. His calm yet commanding presence during interviews with investigators underscored his dedication to holding Mr. Wilkins accountable. Ethan, though nervous, also stepped forward to share his story. Supported by his father, he recounted the humiliations he had endured, from the racist remarks to the physical altercation. His bravery inspired other students to come forward as well, their collective voices painting a damning picture of Mr. Wilkins' abusive behavior. As the investigation unfolded, additional allegations surfaced from Mr. Wilkins' previous places of employment. Former colleagues described him as a disciplinarian who often crossed the line, while former students shared eerily similar accounts of mistreatment. One particularly damning piece of evidence came from a retired teacher who had worked alongside Mr. Wilkins. In a sworn affidavit, she detailed several instances where he had targeted minority students, manipulating the system to avoid consequences. Daniel worked tirelessly behind the scenes, organizing parent meetings, collecting statements, and ensuring the investigation stayed on course. Despite the emotional toll, he remained steadfast, determined to see justice served. After weeks of interviews, testimonies, and document reviews, the committee presented its findings to the school board. The report was unequivocal: Mr. Wilkins had engaged in a pattern of discriminatory and abusive behavior over the course of his career. The board convened a public meeting to announce their decision. Parents, students, and community members packed the auditorium, eager to hear the outcome. When the board president finally spoke, her words were met with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. Based on the overwhelming evidence, the board has decided to terminate Mr. Wilkins' employment effective immediately. Furthermore, we will be implementing new policies to ensure the safety and well-being of all students moving forward. The room erupted in applause. Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him as he hugged Ethan tightly. For the first time in weeks, his son smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression of happiness. Mr. Wilkins, who was present at the meeting, attempted to defend himself, claiming he had been unfairly targeted. But his protests were drowned out by the applause and the stern looks from the board members. As the meeting adjourned, parents approached Daniel to thank him for his leadership and persistence. He shook hands, exchanged hugs, and reassured them that this was just the beginning of a brighter future for their children. With Mr. Wilkins no longer a threat, Riverview Middle School began the process of rebuilding. The board appointed a new teacher to take over his classes, a compassionate and experienced educator who quickly earned the trust of students and parents alike. Ethan, once hesitant to speak up in class, began to find his voice. Encouraged by his father's unwavering support, he joined the debate team and started participating in community events. Daniel, too, found a new sense of purpose. He began volunteering at the school, offering to teach self-defense classes and mentoring students who struggled with confidence. His background as an MMA champion became an asset, inspiring kids to stand up for themselves and others. The community rallied around the school, raising funds for anti-bullying programs and diversity training for staff. The events surrounding Mr. Wilkins' downfall became a turning point, fostering a culture of inclusivity and mutual respect. For Ethan, the experience was transformative. He no longer saw himself as a victim but as someone capable of overcoming adversity. His grades improved, his friendships deepened, and his confidence grew with each passing day. Several months later, Ethan and Daniel were invited to an award ceremony at the school. Ethan's history project, which focused on the contributions of underrepresented figures in American history, had earned him first place in a statewide competition. As Ethan stood on stage, accepting his award, the audience erupted in applause. Daniel watched proudly from his seat, his chest swelling with pride. For a moment, he thought back to the tumultuous events that had brought them to this point. Despite the hardships, they had emerged stronger, closer, and more resilient. After the ceremony, Ethan and Daniel stood together outside the school, basking in the glow of their shared triumph. "You did it, buddy," Daniel said, ruffling Ethan's hair. "No, Dad," Ethan replied with a smile. "We did it." Daniel chuckled, pulling his son into a bear hug. "You're right. And don't you ever forget, you're stronger than you think. Always stand up for what's right." As they walked to their car, the sun set in the distance, casting a warm glow over the school. It wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the start of a new one, filled with hope, determination, and the unbreakable bond between a father and his son.